recent weeks, allegations surrounding a decade-long grooming scandal in the UK has resurfaced, fueled by controversial social media posts from Elon Musk. Welcome back to Rick's Europe, Paul Embery, trade unionist and writer and political commentator for GB News.
Good to be with you.
So could you tell us a little bit about these accusations from Elon Musk? What is the history behind it, and also how has he responded, Keir Starmer?
Well, the whole scandal that you said goes back a decade. In fact, it's probably more than that. It's probably closer to a couple of decades now. And it centres on gangs of largely Pakistani Muslim men operating in a number of towns across England who deliberately targeted young, in many cases underage girls. The girls were almost exclusively white. Many of them were from troubled and disadvantaged backgrounds. And these gangs carried out the most horrific sexual abuse of these youngsters, of these young girls. And that, of course, in itself is bad enough. But to compound the scandal, there were many people in authority, and various inquiries into some of the gangs in some of the towns have demonstrated this, that there were a number of people in authority, such as police officers, such as council leaders, and so on, who were concerned about the impact it would have on community tensions if some of these horrific incidents were brought to light, if too much publicity was given to them. So in many cases, some of these people in authority turned a blind eye to what was going on. And even worse, in some cases, they actually blamed the victims themselves. And Elon Musk has got involved in the row in recent weeks. And that came about because a government minister, Jess Phillips, was asked by a council in the north of England, Oldham, a place called Oldham, a town called Oldham, where some of this abuse had taken place. She was asked by council leaders in Oldham to set up a national public inquiry into the scandal, and she refused to do so. And she said that we will just have local councils carrying out their own local inquiries, which really isn't good enough. And that prompted Elon Musk to get involved in the row and to attack the Labour government for that, and for the whole scandal. And I have to say, some of his comments, I think, have been a bit misplaced. I think he's made some accusations which were not accurate. But the main point that he has raised, which is that this scandal has gone on, and the media as well did not cover it to the extent they have covered other scandals. For example, the George Floyd scandal, and the Windrush scandal in this country, where people immigrants from a West Indian background were wrongly deported. The Stephen Lawrence scandal going back 20 years, where a young black lad was knifed to death by white youths. The media, understandably, gave a lot of publicity to those scandals, and they haven't really done it to the same extent with the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, or rape gang scandal, I should say. So that's the background to it, and it has caused considerable controversy in Britain in recent weeks, and that debate is still going on today.
And how have these allegations that Musk has made resonated with the general public and the political circles in the UK?
I think they've resonated with a lot of people, but we need to remember that there are also lots of people in Britain who are not particularly familiar with Elon Musk, because they aren't active on Twitter, or X as it's called now. So it's not being driven completely by Elon Musk. There are other voices as well in the country who are urging the government to call a national public inquiry. And from what I can see, and I think some of the polling has proved this, that has broad support in the country. This scandal, which, as I say, has now been going on for the best part of 2 decades, there's a sense among people that it was just simply too uncomfortable for people in authority to confront head on, which is why we've never had a proper national public inquiry. There have been various local inquiries, and there was one national inquiry, but not specifically into the issue of the rape gangs. It was into the issue of child abuse generally, and the issue of rape gangs only formed quite a small part of that. And didn't take into account a lot of the evidence. And what the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, has said, and I sympathise with her on this, there's never been a national public inquiry which has joined the dots, which has considered the very obvious ethnic and cultural dimensions to the abuse. Nobody wants to talk about that, because to talk about the ethnic and cultural dimensions is too uncomfortable for a lot of people, and they're too nervous about the implications of it. I think in many cases, because if we were to have that honest debate and that honest inquiry, it would raise a lot of issues about the impact of multiculturalism in our society, the impact of immigration, mass immigration, our failure at integrating people. And so, given that multiculturalism is a sacred belief among many people within our political class, you can see why they are resistant to a national public inquiry, because I think it would undermine that belief quite seriously. But we need to keep pushing, because the argument, I think, is unanswerable. There needs to be a national public inquiry, and the issue isn't going to go away.
And I understand that Keir Starmer, he discredited Elon Musk's posts as misinformation. Has that been effective, or could they take a more proactive stance against these posts and attacks, so to speak?
I think the problem with Keir Starmer is his instinctive reaction to things like this is to suggest that it's being driven by the far right, or it's being driven by various kind of nefarious actors. And look, there's no doubt that some people on the far right are exploiting it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a national public inquiry. That doesn't mean that we should hide the issue. There are many people in the mainstream in politics in this country, and mainstream citizens, who don't have far-right politics, who have got very serious concerns and serious questions about what's gone on. They know that the media hasn't covered it. The media, they reported the outcome of the trials where some of these gangs were convicted, but it was all done in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. Very few people in the media said, actually, we need to start joining the dots. We need to start talking about why these rape gangs are springing up in Pakistani Muslim communities, and why they are attacking young white girls. If it were the other way round, if it was groups of white men who were almost exclusively attacking young Asian girls, for example, I can imagine that the media coverage of that would be far more extensive than what we saw over the years with the scandal that did occur. And I think people are seeing that, and they're uncomfortable that there are still attempts by people in authority to stifle an honest debate about this. And if we had a national inquiry, it would give us some very uncomfortable truths, I'm sure about that. But that's not a reason not to have it. We need to start confronting some of these issues head on.
Now that the debate has sort of come to light again, has there been talk of any policy changes or reforms in the UK in regards to this?
Well, I know the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, just a moment ago, before we started talking, actually, she was in the House of Commons talking about this issue and making some sort of commitment, as I understand it, to some more local inquiries. I'll need to see the detail of that before I can comment further. But so far, the government has been holding out on the calls for a national public inquiry. Part of that may be driven by the fact that in some of these towns where some of this horrendous abuse took place, and there were thousands of victims. I mean, we're talking about a huge number of victims in some of these towns like Rotherham and Rochdale and Telford and Bristol and lots of other places as well. Some of the council leaders were members of the Labour Party. They were Labour representatives in many cases, because a lot of these places are working class towns where Labour is heavily represented. And I suspect there's a fear among some people in the Labour Party that it would expose some Labour councils for the sheer failure to protect these young girls, and the fact that council leaders turned a blind eye. But with something serious like this, I mean, we've had public inquiries into all sorts of things in this country. We've had public inquiries into phone hacking by newspapers. We've had a public inquiry into undercover policing. We had a public inquiry into the horrific Grenfell Tower fire. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have had public inquiries into those things, but I think a lot of people are thinking, well, if we can have public inquiries for those sorts of things, where we examine the evidence, we try to find out who was responsible, we try to learn the lessons, why on earth are we not having a national public inquiry into what is arguably the most horrific atrocity in the modern history of Britain? I mean, I don't overstate it when I say that. We are talking about thousands and thousands of young female victims, many of them underage. That merits a national public inquiry, in my view, and I think the clamour for that will grow. And if I were running the Labour Party, I would concede now that that's what we needed to do, to hold a national public inquiry.
What do you think is likely to come of this, apart from, well, hopefully a national inquiry? Is there any other changes that we might see?
Well, I think politically we're seeing some really interesting things happening in our country at the moment. We're seeing a Labour government that came to power on a huge majority just 6 months ago. Their popularity has taken a nosedive. I mean, even though they came to power on a large majority, because of the kind of nature of the British political system, it didn't necessarily mean that they had huge support out there in the country. One person described it as a loveless landslide, which I think is probably quite accurate. But so far as they did have any popularity, it has taken a bit of a slump in the months since. And what we're seeing particularly, I think, not just since the election, but a long time before the election, is the working class in this country, who traditionally supported the Labour Party, many working class people anyway, have fallen out of love with the Labour Party in a big way. And there's a massive disconnect, a massive cultural disconnect between the Labour Party and working class communities. And actually we're seeing now the rise of Reform, which is led by Nigel Farage, which is now surging in the polls, and last week actually led the polls for the first time in its history. And at the general election, Reform came second in 98 constituencies. 89 of those constituencies were won by the Labour Party, and 60 of those constituencies were in the north of England, what was called the Red Wall, Labour's traditional strongholds. So Reform pose a real threat to Labour now in some of those constituencies, and working class people are now looking to Reform as some sort of alternative, especially over things like the rape gangs, over issues such as immigration and crime and so on. I personally don't think that Reform is the answer for working class people, but many of them are looking towards it. And unless Labour gets a grip on this issue, on the rape gangs, unless it gets a grip on the broader issue of immigration and gets the numbers down, because the numbers at the moment are astronomical, unless it gets growth into the economy quite quickly, unless it starts to fix our broken National Health Service, then I think its popularity will slump even further. And then I think potentially everything's up for grabs. It's interesting times.
Thank you very much, Paul Embery, trade unionist and writer and political commentator for GB News, for your comments today.
Pleasure.
And thank you for watching Rick's Europe.